Hi, everyone. So now that we've discussed the fact that, contrary to what we've assumed in the course up to this point, now that we've seen that not all phonological processes necessarily always apply in every context where we expect them to, the question is how we can perhaps analyze apparent exceptions to phonological processes. How do we deal with the possible exceptions? Our textbook, Introductory Phonology, tries to class exceptions into two bins or into two groups. So we can sort them into two boxes. Here's one box of exceptions and here's another box of exceptions. So on the one hand, we have items where the word exceptionally does not undergo the rule. And these could be labeled as exceptions to the normally productive major rules. So here the term major and minor rule is used to mean a major rule would be a phonological process of the language which we usually expect to apply all the time. That is, we expect it to be an instance of productivity type A or productivity type B. But there are some instances, some words or some contexts in which the rule fails to apply. Then on the other hand, there are processes where the words that undergo the process are the exceptional ones. And these can be labeled as words that undergo minor rules. So in that case, the normal condition, the normal state is that this rule doesn't apply normally so if you invent a new context for that rule, we expect it to not apply. But there are some cases of words or where the rule does seem to exist. The real formalization of productivity is quite a difficult area. And when we talk about phonological variation next week, we will look into this problem a bit more. Under this simple approach in the textbook where there are these two boxes or bins, we can simply label lexical items with a special marking, a special diacritic, as we can also call it. So the exceptions to the major rules can be marked as minus some rule, as non-undergoers, and the ones that undergo a minor rule are labeled as plus some rule. So we can say in these cases that there are positive exceptions and negative exceptions. So type 2, we have positive exceptions, words that exceptionally undergo a process, and type 1, we have negative exceptions, words that exceptionally fail to undergo a process, which normally productively does operate in a language. However, there is a slight conundrum here insofar as one ever finds any novel undergoers of minor rules. So under this theory, there can't be any novel undergoers of minor rules, of words that are not really productive. Because in order for a word to that doesn't already exist to be able to undergo a non-productive rule, the lexical item needs to be labeled as plus this rule, plus rule X. So a speaker would have to hear the new lexical item, to encounter the new lexical item, and decide to put it in the plus rule X bin. So as I've said, this simple model would seem to predict that minor rules can never be productively applied. But the reality of the situation is indeed more complicated. Sometimes there are cases in which rules that seem to require the plus marking of minor rules are applied to new examples. So as an instance, let's exemplify these distinctions a little more and look at some sorts of minor productivity. So one case of minor productivity could involve English verbs that end in the sequence E, that form a past tense in F. So by minor productivity, I mean these are precisely instances in which we would need a productive, we would need plus rule X to be applied to new WUG forms. So to account for these words that have this eep, ep alternation, we can assume that the past tense forms are built with the suffix da, but that a rule of e lowering applies, where an e becomes a vowel when followed by two consonants, maybe only at the end of the word. So here are some existing words of English, the present tense forms creep, weep, sweep, leap, keep, which in their past tense forms become crept, wept, swept, leapt, and kept. An issue now, the interesting point is that there are some, as Albright and Hayes' 2003 experiment showed, sometimes new stems seem to sound good with a past tense form in ept. So for instance, when speakers are given wug forms neep or neep, they seem to think that the past tense forms nept or mept sound okay. They sound like possible, reasonably well-formed past tense forms to a present tense form neep or meep. However, at the same time, not all existing verbs of English do undergo e lowering in this context. So for instance, the verb beep, its past tense form is beeped without the application of e lowering. So e lowering, I think, is not a general major process of English. It's not really the case that the vowel e, when followed by two consonants, is systematically lowered to eh. Instead, it's something particular to this past tense morphological context, but nevertheless, speakers are willing to accept and believe that in that context, the application of e lowering is acceptable. Let's look in a bit more detail about these two types of exceptions now. So under type 1, we have productive or major rules that fail to undergo the process. So I think an early chapter of the textbook, there is a so-called optional rule of postnasal T deletion in American English discussed. So there's an instance where an underlying voiceless alveolar stop following an alveolar nasal is optionally deleted. So for the moment, we'll just take this to mean sometimes the rule can be applied and sometimes not. So for words like underlying planter and winter, they can be realized as either planner or planter, and winner or winter. So the stop here can be deleted. We can describe the rule as something like this. A T is deleted after an N preceding a stressless syllable. And in the textbook, Hayes explicitly points out that there are at least a couple words of English which are exceptions to this rule in that they simply cannot undergo the application of the rule whatsoever. These are the words intuition and intonation. So trying to produce forms intuition. You can see from my reaction that that seems pretty strange. Intuition with deletion of the stop, or intonation, again, sounds very strange, are ill-formed. It's possible that there's something, we could try to find a more specific phonological context and explain it, but for a moment, this could serve as a way of explaining our diacritic feature. So we could assume that these two lexical items, intuition and intonation, are labeled as minus postnasal T deletion. So in the information about this word in the lexicon, part of that information is saying these two words, intuition and intonation, cannot undergo postnasal T deletion. So here we take intonation, and we see that the option of postnasal T deletion is not there at all, in contrast to the word winter, where it can be realized as either winter or winter. The other type whereby we have unproductive or minor rules, which are marked as undergoers, concerns the case from Jean Berco's WUG test, where native speakers disagreed to some extent on the plural form of a noun heath. So in English, there seems to be a process whereby there are some underlying instances of a voiceless labiodental fricative F, which become voiced before a voiced obstruent, especially in the plural form is the usual instance where we see this. So the process from the purely phonological point of view simply states that an underlying F becomes voiced preceding a voiced obstruent. So some nouns of English, like knife, leaf, or wife, show an alternation where we get a the in the plural. And so we have knife, knives, leaf, leaves, wife, wives, and so on. But not all nouns undergo this. So words like laugh or safe have a plural form with s. There, the underlying z is subject to obstruent devoicing, and there the underlying z is subject to obstruent devoicing, and nothing happens to the underlying f. So, and in general, the ones on the right constitute the majority, I think, in the English lexicon. The ones on the left are exceptional. So most nouns ending in an underlying voiceless labiodental fricative receive the plural suffix za, which then undergoes devoicing to s as expected. And there's a minority on the left-hand column that change the underlying voiceless labiodental fricative to a voiced labiodental fricative instead. Now we can wonder, what should we expect if F voicing were a general or major rule? And the consequence would be that we should expect all noun stems ending in F to have a plural in this. So we would have belief, believes, rather than belief, beliefs, and cuff, cuffs, instead of cuff, cuffs, and so on and so on. So in this case, we would simply say that the words which do undergo F voicing are lexically labeled as plus F voicing. This tells, this is an instruction to the phonological grammar that says use the F voicing rule if the word is so marked. So showing a derivation here, if we begin from the roots, leaf and wreath in contrast, where leaf is marked as plus F voicing, but wreath is not, then they build their plural forms morphologically, so the suffix z, underlying z, is attached. F voicing applies in this case, creating leaves, and then after that, obstruent devoicing applies. So we should ask, in this case, we can pause for a moment to think about the rule ordering relationship between F voicing and obstruent devoicing. So as a result of the application, so if we should actually think if obstruent devoicing applied before F voicing, what would obstruent devoicing do? Obstruent devoicing would change the underlying z into an s, and then if that happened first, then there would no longer be this context for F voicing needed over here. So if obstruent devoicing had applied first, it would bleed F voicing. So there must be a counter-bleeding relationship here. If obstruent devoicing applied first, we would find the plural leafs with a voiceless F rather than a voiced the. So obstruent devoicing counterbleeds F voicing in English. Now, what then really is the distinction between cases where a rule that is, where between cases where minus rule x and cases where plus rule x would be used in terms of the productivity of the phonological rules. So the normal circumstance, what we usually assume, is that the phonological rules that we can discover are normal, productive, or major undergoers. So our default assumption is that a rule is a major rule, and we should expect new words to undergo the rule. So it's exceptional if you find forms that don't undergo a rule, that fail to undergo a rule. The opposite is where the instances where stems need to be marked as plus rule x, and those involve less productive rules in cases where the rule's application itself is something exceptional, something notable. Before coming to our last topic for today, I want to point something out about how the rule of F voicing is formulated in the textbook, which is something we usually want to avoid. So in the formulation of the textbook, the rule actually explicitly refers to morphological information, saying that this process applies at the edge of a nominal stem when when the word which has been built has the morphosyntactic feature plus plural. And this reference to morphological features, to morphological characteristics in a phonological rule is something we generally want to avoid. However, in this case, it might be necessary to refer to these aspects of morphology because there are other morphemes in English which have the underlying form, the underlying phonological form z, which fail to undergo F voicing when attached to these stems which show F voicing in their noun plural, like leaves. So in building the possessive form of the word leaf, I think I would say the leaf's color and not the leaves color. And if we make a denominal verb in the third person singular present, I would say the cat leafs through the book. The cat turns the pages of the book. Again, the suffix would be voiceless in that case. So it does seem to be the case that F voicing really only does apply to certain stems and only really applies in the formation of noun plurals and not in other morphosyntactic contexts. So maybe it's necessary to somehow refer to morphological information, but using morphological information in phonological rules in this way should really be a last resort when we can find that, well, there's the same phonological, there are cases where we find the same phonological environment and the same base, the same stem. So in this case, we're dealing with the lexicon item leaf in all of these cases, and we see that a process applies in some morphosyntactic context, or context, but not in others. And if we are looking at a truly productive rule, a major rule, then it should never be necessary to refer to morphology. Referring to morphology in the case of a truly productive phonological process, a major phonological process, would only obscure the larger phonological generalization. Sometimes people are tempted to unnecessarily refer to morphosyntactic features if they mostly see the operation of some process under particular conditions, like say that the application of a phonological process is mostly seen in alternations between the singular and the plural of nouns. One might be tempted to say, that is a process that only applies in forming the plural of nouns. But if it is a process that always applies regularly and we can find even one or two instances of application beyond that morphosyntactic context, or we don't have any evidence that it doesn't apply outside that morphosyntactic context, we should assume that we have a major rule, a productive rule, that doesn't require any reference to aspects of the morphology or the morphosyntax. All right, let's take another break here, and then we'll come back to cover. We'll look at a point that becomes quite problematic for us as phonologists.